Hi, welcome to Neural Basis of Language. My name is Lina Pulkkinen and I'll be your professor for this course. I think it's really important for scientists to always explain why people should care about their research questions, why the research questions are important. So let's start there. Let's ask the question why we should care about the neural basis of language. Why is this an important question? I'll give you 3 reasons. And the first reason is that language simply is a really fascinating cognitive system in the brain. I would argue probably the most fascinating cognitive system, but I may be biased. And to appreciate that, let's just look at some examples to understand why language is so interesting. And to start with, I'm interested in the sentence, professors record lectures in sweatpants. Probably a true sentence of a lot of professors these days. And specifically, I'm interested in the interpretation of the prepositional phrase in sweatpants. How does that prepositional phrase contribute to the meaning of the sentence? So here, everybody probably reads this sentence as meaning that it is the professors who are in the sweatpants. It doesn't really make any sense to think that the lecturers would be somehow wearing sweatpants. However, we can show that it is possible for the prepositional phrase in sweatpants to also go with the noun that comes right before it. So if you say something like a student saw a professor in sweatpants, it's very easy to get the interpretation that it's the professor who's wearing the sweatpants. Okay, so we could form the hypothesis that when we have this kind of what we usually call a modifier in sweatpants, we kind of associate it with a noun that it kind of plausibly goes with, like you get a nice coherent meaning, or maybe you look for a kind of a plausible noun that's close to this prepositional phrase, something like that. You kind of work out those 2 constraints. However, that really doesn't work. That's not the right theory. And we can clearly see that when we look at a sentence like, professors learn students' names in sweatpants. So here, it's really not the students who are in the sweatpants. Rather, it has to be the professors. Even though students are closer to the sweatpants, and students probably are more plausibly in sweatpants generally, nevertheless, it's the professors that have to be in the sweatpants. And we can see that even more sharply if we make the subject position, so that's the position in which we here have professors, be something that is not animate, something that just wouldn't wear sweatpants ever. So for example, if we have a sentence like, the roster lists students' names in sweatpants, that's just kind of a funny sentence, given that the sweatpants the roster wouldn't be able to wear them, and it's not the students either. So here, there's something about the structure of the sentence that dictates what the sweatpants can modify. And that structural constraint, which is what syntactic theory would characterize, tells us that it can't be the students in that position. So that's just fascinating, and so it's something that we want to understand about the human mind. There are other places in the sentence where we could put in sweatpants, and it's interesting to think about the contributions to the meaning of the sentence that you would get from those other positions. So for example, a student in sweatpants saw a professor is a good sentence, right? You can say this in English. And we can think about the relationship between this sentence and the sentence that I had here above, a student saw a professor in sweatpants. Do these sentences mean the same under some readings, or are they completely different? So when we say a student saw a professor in sweatpants, and we're thinking about the student as wearing the sweatpants, is that the same as a student in sweatpants saw a professor? I want you to think about that. if you're really hooked on this now, you can also play with sentences in which we have a modifier in both positions, and maybe they're different modifiers. And so now, if these are very semantically equivalent positions, then sentences like professors in New York teach students in sweatpants should be pretty equivalent to professors in sweatpants teach students in New York. But it turns out that's not the case. So these are fascinating phenomena about the English grammar, and that's something that linguists work on to try to understand how is it that our brains put together these meanings so quickly and automatically. And it turns out that our brains are just full of really cool kind of tacit knowledge about the distributional properties of expressions. So language is fascinating and fun. Language is also one of the most important cognitive systems in our brains. So without language, our ability to express our thoughts and to understand the world is very, very limited. Of course, we have other ways to express our thoughts through art, through dance. There are other ways to express ourselves, but really the main one is language. And so here's a thought experiment that is perhaps a little grim, but it's something that you could think about. And that is that if brain damage were to wipe out most of your cognitive abilities and you could just keep one, which one would you keep? And so here's a list of some cognitive abilities that you could choose from. So your memory, your ability to make decisions, emotion, the ability to feel stuff, language, your ability to learn, your ability to reason. These are all aspects of so-called higher cognition. If you could just keep one, which one would you keep? I'll leave you with that thought. Turns out this is not just a thought experiment in the world. This kind of question can become quite real in the context of brain surgery. So in brain surgery, doctors work very hard to try to make sure they don't remove any bits of language. So in brain surgery, we're often taking out some part of the brain that is causing a problem. So obviously that part might have a tumor, for example. And when we're taking the part out, we want to make sure we're not also taking out something that's really important for the patient cognitively. And language is a huge priority in this kind of a situation. And this kind of a study of the functional contribution of cortex that might be removed in the context of surgery is called presurgical language mapping. And I have a YouTube link here to a video that shows you a little bit about it. And so what I mean here is that imagine that this is your brain, and let's just say that there is a tumor in the brain right here. So this is a tumor that needs to be removed. So now, before we go ahead and remove that tumor, we need to establish exactly how much of the cortex around the tumor is going to be removed. So let's just say that we would ideally take out this much cortex in order to have kind of a clean margin to the resection, the part that we're taking out. And what doctors would do is they would have the patient do language tests while running a small transient current in one part of the cortex, which blocks processing in that part of the cortex, and see if the patient can still do the task. And if they can't, then the doctor is going to be like, okay, well, that part is really important for language. We're not going to cut that. We're going to draw the line like a little bit differently in order to spare that context. So in order to be able to do this kind of work in an informed way, we need to understand the neural basis of language. We need to have basic science that characterizes it. Otherwise, this type of work in the clinical setting is sort of operating in the dark. And the last reason that I'll give you here is that language really permeates through other cognitive systems. And that's because our brains are in some sense doing language all the time. And here's one way to kind of see that in actual data. Let me put myself over here. So this is neuroimaging data that on the one hand shows the type of activation that is elicited in the brain when we're using language to convey meaning. So various kinds of semantic tasks where we're using language. And at the bottom, you see brain activity that's elicited when we're just doing nothing. It's a so-called default state network or resting state network that shows activity when the participant, the study participant, is not engaged in any active task. They're just kind of lying there doing nothing. And it turns out, so this is obviously a very fundamental part of our brain's function because it's kind of a consistent set of regions that we observe being active across many different types of individuals. And it turns out that it's very similar to the brain's general semantic network as is shown here. And we think that's because when we're just kind of at rest or not actively engaged with the task, there's a sort of language or so-called inner speech that is going on in our brains. And it obviously affects our cognition in very profound ways. So one reason to care about the neural basis of language is that language really is everywhere in the brain and affects many different types of tasks because we're always kind of operating through language. So we really cannot understand the brain without understanding language. So let's wrap up. Why should we care about the neural basis of language? Well, first of all, language is really fun. Language is full of cool phenomena that we want to understand, and we want to understand the brain basis of this phenomenon. Second, language is really important for the brain and for humans. And finally, language is everywhere in the brain. It affects most different types of tasks. And next, we'll be asking, what is language really? And what is the brain? I'll see you then.